Right, I think we can go ahead. Those members that are late, they can join us as they come in. Good morning to all of the TESD, CEA TESD members and CEA, other CEA members. We as an EXCO from the TESD side has decided that it's pretty important that we understand what the National Labour Migration Policy and Employment Services Amendment Act holds in for our businesses within the TESD space. And to that extent, we thought it important to get some insights and some other information from the likes of John Botha and Natalie Singer. John and Natalie are well known to most of us, but just for the sake of introduction and giving you, for those of you that don't know them, and John, with your permission, I will give Natalie's bio first. Not that I'm sexist or anything, but it's just she's prettier than you. All right, so to introduce Natalie, throughout Natalie's career in staffing, she's been in the forefront of lobbying and advocacy initiatives, including securing professional recognition for the industry with SACWA, preparing the industry position paper on the 2010 labour law amendments and raising awareness of the importance of the sector helping South Africa transition into the realities of the fourth industrial revolution. Natalie continues to serve as the Confederation of Associations of the Private Employment Services, or CAPES, and is a member of the bilateral task team with the Department of Labour, driving compliance and job creation opportunities. Currently, Natalie represents Business for South Africa and is the business lead in the UIF operational task team, unblocking challenges within the COVID-19 TERS and e-compliance issues. And that's probably why she will go grey very soon. Natalie is also an executive consultant to global business solutions and enabling clients to achieve people-centric competitive advantages through future-fit organizational design structures and HR interventions. So that's quite a mouthful, and welcome, Natalie. John, on the other hand, John is a specialist in the workforce strategy and transformation and planning. He's held a global executive position for global workforce solutions provider for many years. He was a negotiator at NETLAC for around 7 years and represents South Africa at the International Labour Organization and International Labour Council. On 3 occasions in Geneva, he holds a BCom honours degree, a postgraduate diploma in labour law, and certificates in design thinking from MIT and the US. John also has more than 20 years experience as an employment equity consultant. And welcome and thank you, John and Natalie, for giving us your time and giving us your insights so we can understand the impact that these amendments will have. Just as a matter of housekeeping, Natalie will only be available for an hour in the session. So any members that have questions, please, by raising your hands, Krista will then acknowledge you and the question can be asked and answered. So John and Natalie, without further ado, over to you.
Thank you very much. As you correctly said, we've been in the industry for some time, and it's always great to look at the delegates on these sessions, a number of very, very familiar names. So thank you for the opportunity. We're going to get right into it in a minute. Natalie and I are going to do a bit of a dog and pony. The issue really is I focus on the workforce impact, the workforce solutions and design. Natalie's done incredible work in terms of the substantive content of this. So really, if we take a look at what Natalie's going to go through, colleagues, I want you to keep in mind what it is that your clients are thinking. If we're going to be client-centric, you've got to put yourself in their shoes. Now, with this national labour migration policy and with a massive impact, we estimate probably 500,000 foreign nationals that are currently working may have to, in one way or the other, be impacted, most of them probably not to return. given the strict regulations. As a result of that, how do your service provision, how do your SLAs, how do your designs in terms of providing assignees to clients, how is that impacted, and how do you start planning for that? We need to know more than our clients do about these topics to give value add. So at the back end of this, I'm going to give you a framework of potentially how to approach this proactively with your clients. We've got probably 7 months left within which we need to be very, very, very clear as to how this is going to affect us. So please bear that in mind. But Natalie, I'm going to hand over to you. Colleagues, post your questions to Nats while she's speaking so that we can get maximum benefit from her while she is on. Thank you.
Thanks, John, and LB, and welcome to everybody. The slides will be made available afterwards as well, and some of you may have also seen the submission document, which is a very detailed submission document, which was prepared by CAPES and is available as a reference point for more specific technical discussions around the National Labour Migration Policy, as well as the Employment Services Act amendments, particularly as they pertain to the private employment agencies and temporary employment services. So, of course, if you want to have any questions about any of that, please do, once you've had a chance to read through them, reach out to us and we will gladly take you through it. So the focus really today, as John has pointed out, is focused on the foreign workers and the impact on foreign workers. I think we're all very familiar with the escalating tensions that we've seen across the country over the last several years, particularly in sectors like the long distance truck drivers who've been literally and figuratively under attack. In many cases, we've seen huge damage to fleets and to businesses as a result, with some even long-standing transportation companies choosing, in fact, to just close their doors rather than deal with what's happening. And it's a culmination of a range of things. Of course, we're sitting at record unemployment rates, escalated through the COVID-19 period. In fact, the highest joblessness rate in the world. And scarily, we are measuring it against the narrow definition and not even the broader definition. When one starts to unpack that down to youth levels, it gets above the 60%. And so you can understand why there is a focus on saying where there are jobs available, those jobs really should, as far as is possible, be, and I'm hesitating to use the word reserved, but they should be for South Africans and for South Africans first. We've seen movements now like Operation Dudula kind of raise their heads. They have all kinds of other political connotations and associated, I'm sure, as most things. But there definitely is a big push now towards addressing what is perceived to be an oversupply of foreign nationals within the country, which is creating unemployment. And I think that's a simplified assessment, but of course, perception is one man's reality. And so the government is faced with the challenge in trying to balance, ultimately, developing a competitive economy, which has the appropriately skilled, motivated, and productive workforce that we need, one that has labor market policies which are future fit and globally competitive. Interestingly, the Institute for International Organization of Employers, the IOE, their research recommends that for a competitive economy, we should have 10% as migrant labor in terms of global competitiveness. In South Africa, we're looking at about, if we look at the transformation numbers, and we'll get to those in a minute, it's only about 3.5%. So we're a long way short of what is perceived or considered to be internationally the benchmark. However, we've got this oversimplification now, it's politicized, and so there's this balancing act that government needs to get right in terms of ensuring that the policy framework is one that ensures that as a country and as a member of the ILO, South Africa doesn't take care of any migrant workers who are in the country, that we steer far away from xenophobic, particularly xenophobic attacks and violence, and that we also create an environment where it is a South Africans first policy particularly in low-skilled roles. So the balance is really around how do we manage the expectations of the South African population to access work, as well as the perception that there is a high number of especially undocumented foreigners who are distorting labour market access. How do we also ensure that we don't in the process block our opportunities to bring in critical and scarce skill, which we definitely need? We know that we have a dearth in certain sectors. I had to have a giggle yesterday. On the news, we saw Health Minister Joe Botha lamenting the fact that we have a chronic shortage of doctors in the country. And in fact, it's estimated that for every one doctor, they are responsible for 1,000 citizens. It's completely skewed by international standards. And yet you'll see when I show you the critical skills list, which accompanies the National Labour Migration Policy, doctors have been removed by government off the list. So again, it's a situation of perhaps one hand, the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing. In this process, of course, in changing the rules around who can access work legally in the country, there also needs to be consideration as to how do we, as a country, manage the correct exit and safety and security of migrant workers in line with those international labour standards. And then, of course, balancing the political stuff and economic stuff in terms of cooperation within the SADC region. And specifically within the SADC region, we see the biggest impact. We have what are known as exemption permits, particularly popular among Zimbabweans. We have a very big Zimbabwean contingent in our country, given the economic situation cross-border. And those were all as a result of engagements happening at a political level and particularly under the Zuma administration, and all part of how do we manage those relationships between countries. And now these changes under the labour migration policy, whilst being seen as positive, of course, for South Africans in our own labour market, has, of course, the knock-on impact in terms of upsetting some of those arrangements. So the goals really or the priorities of the National Labour Migration Policy, there are 6 key priorities. The first and arguably most important is that we need to ensure that we are able to attract and retain skills within the country to meet the temporary shortages and long-term needs of the economy, those that are of a critical nature or a scarce nature specifically. They are proposing quotas to limit the number of foreigners, and specifically in certain sectors, with a view to protecting jobs for South Africans with the South African First policy. Again, in principle, it doesn't necessarily sound like a bad thing, but we know that quotas don't always translate into reality. The agricultural sector is a prime example, very low skilled jobs, and yet particularly farmers in Limpopo and in Mpumalanga struggling to get local people to do the work, and so out of need are utilizing foreign workers. And it's those sort of low-skilled sectors which are specifically being targeted from a quota point of view. Third is prioritizing certain sectors in need of those critical skills. And here the goal is to ultimately create talent pipelines and skills planning within those sectors. You'll see there is within this document a reinforcement of the principle that any visaed individual should be passing on knowledge, should be mentoring, should be training as part and parcel of the process of skills transfer. Again, a very nice theoretical construct, but you know, a 2-year visa is not going to enable a person who's gone to university for 5 years and gained 10 years worth of experience to automatically transfer all of that knowledge over to another individual within a short space of time. It is about improving conditions for those who are legitimately in South Africa as migrant workers, to make sure that we eliminate any xenophobic or inhumane or illegal treatment of vulnerable people, to improve social protections of migrant workers, as well as helping them to transition back to their countries of origin, and then to make sure that we have all the legal infrastructure in place that help to create an effective mechanism between particularly the SADC member states. John and Chris, I'm going to ask, I can't see the comments box, so if any do pop up, won't you just let me know. In terms
Good
of
so far,
timelines,
Nat.
okay, great, thanks. In terms of timelines, these are the timelines which have been published alongside the National Labour Migration Policy. We are a bit behind here. We have gone into the public consultation though. It is a bit of a mess. We did circulate the details of the roadshows as much as is possible. We continue to reach out to our Dell colleagues to get clarity, and we'll update you as we go. But the public hearings are taking place predominantly in this month of May. Interestingly, but perhaps also tactically, the sessions are being held outside of the major centres. We're seeing sessions being held in quite rural and remote locations, presumably in areas where there are high levels of unemployment, and this the belief that there would be some inputs given. Newcastle as an example, as opposed to Durban. We're seeing it in Northern Cape and Kimberley and in other kind of outlying areas. Of course, the feedback comes not only through those public consultations, but through the written submission process, which I referenced at the beginning of the session. And we do encourage all of you to please assist. You can use the baseline of the CAPE submission document. There is also a BUSA document, which is aligned, which can be used as a foundation. But the request is that you do populate it into your own letterhead and submit it individually. Government does use both a qualitative and quantitative review approach when it comes to looking at public commentary. In terms of when this is expected to go through, it's expected in sort of the June-July timelines, which will then obviously mean that changes would come into play there. What is important to realize, though, is specifically in relation to the exemption permits. The notice was given already in December 2021 that those permits would expire at the 12 months later, which essentially means we've got until December of this year, just a bit more than 6 months, in which to make plans to deal with any workers who are currently working on one of those exemption permits. Again, very popular with, we know, Zimbabwean exemption permits, but they also exist with Angolans, Lesothans, and several other countries as well. At the outset, it is important to differentiate when we talk about foreign nationals. So it's complicated in that when we talk about foreign nationals from an employment equity perspective, a foreign national is anybody who is not a South African by birth, and that would include somebody who is in possession of a South African ID number as a permanent resident, or somebody who was given refugee status and has an ID document. They would still be classified as a foreign national for reporting on employment equity, but they are specifically exempted or outside, let's rather say, not exempted, outside of this process when we're talking about foreign workers. So if somebody is a permanent resident or has refugee status and is in possession of an ID number, and we can see those ID numbers are different, the last 3 digits, the third last digit, as a South African by birth, my ID would have a 0, so 085 is an example on my ID number. If I have a permanent residency or other naturalized citizenship, it would have a 1. So it would be 182 or 181. So that would be how you would know. So if somebody's in possession of an ID, then they would not be part and parcel of this affected cluster of people. Who we are looking at as being impacted are 2 kind of categories. So in the first instance are those who are documented, and they would be documented in one of 2 ways. So the first would be a work visa, which generally has a specified and limited time duration, and it's very often linked to the critical skills list. So it might be a visa that the individual, through their critical skills status, has, and which means they can move between employers as the visa belongs to them or is associated with them. Or it could be a work visa that is linked to a particular opportunity. So it could be an intra-company transfer, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Or it could be an individual who has been given a work visa for a specific role and that if they were to leave that role for any reason, that visa would then essentially expire. The second cluster, which is where the biggest impact is going to be, we believe, are those on the exemption permits. And those are individuals who were given limited residency and the opportunity to operate freely within the labor market environment as a result of those exemption permits. And those are individuals who will be very specifically impacted and would have to exit your workplace in December 2022. The only alternative would be if they were able to be converted into one of the other visa categories. And that, of course, has very specific requirements. It has very specific timelines and documentation processes. Most importantly, it has to be done from their country of origin. So regardless of whether that is successful or not, there will be an impact on the workplace in that that individual will not be able to continue in their role for a period of time. There are also significant numbers of undocumented people in the country. And this is, in fact, employment of these individuals is, in fact, illegal. And so there is going to be a much higher focus from a compliance and inspectorate point of view in assessing workplaces, assessing the citizen status of workforce, and of course, checking those who are there in terms of documentation. I think I'd just like to caution here too that as employers, it's very important to verify as far as is reasonably possible to do your due diligence in regards to the validity of the documentation that you have been provided. We saw this very clearly under COVID-19 TERS. I saw one myself, an example of a client who had applied for an individual. The ID number had been utilized by somebody else. We managed to get the two employers' information together, and as it transpires, those ID numbers were exactly the same. The ID documents were exactly the same, with the exception of the photographs. So we are still unclear as to whether one of those individuals was the authentic individual and the others had been duplicated, or whether in fact these were both fraudulent documents. It was picked up and continued in terms of investigation by the UIF. But unfortunately, it is common that individuals are accessing false documentation. And as an employer, you could find yourself liable for fines.
Nat, can I just come in? Yeah, Krista's got her hand up.
No problem, John. You can continue. I just see there's a question from Paul and also from Yvonne. If I could ask, if you raise your hand, then you can pose your question directly to Natalie. But Paul wants to know, just to clarify, an employee who is recognized as a refugee will still be allowed to continue working regardless of the position they hold within the company. That's from Paul West.
That is my understanding, because they would have been given a South African document. So they would be in possession of an ID.
Okay. And then from Yvonne, what would happen to the employees that have work permits that expire from January 23 onwards? Would their permit now expire in December 22?
Yes. And they would have to consider reapplication. What we are seeing is, of course, a much firmer hand from the department. So, you know, I don't think, even if there have been extensions in the past, I think that employers should be cautious about assuming that an extension or resubmission or reissuing would happen as easily as it did in the past. So those would also be ones that I think should be on the radar.
Thanks,
John,
Natalie.
did you want to come in?
Yeah, maybe just to comment, I'm going to pick this up later on, colleagues, but that's one of the big things that you're going to have to start dealing with now. Because even if people are undocumented, as Nats has pointed out, illegal, undocumented people still have the right to access fair labor practices. And you could very well find yourself, you know, in breach of labor laws and other laws. But we'll pick up on that later on. But now's the time to start doing the due diligence. Thanks, Nats.
Thanks, John. So this is the list, and again, I'm not going to go in great detail, other than to say that what has been quite frustrating, I think, from organized businesses' perspective, is that there has been research conducted. Again, a big challenge within our labor market is we do not have an effective and accurate labor market information system. And so we are still operating fairly blind when it comes to being able to measure the supply and demand of skills within the industry. Part of this process, as it has been in previous years, is doing some research, engaging with different sectors to get a sense of scarcity. Now, again, scarcity is elastic. There's also absolute and relative. We've seen an additional complexity in that COVID-19 has taught us, of course, all of us, as we've seen, that remote work is possible. And so, you know, there is now also the opportunity to access skills potentially cross-border. So they're not even necessarily going to be sitting here in the country, but could be providing you with services. And I'm not going to go into too much detail now, but there is a whole section within the submission which deals with this idea of platform workers, of cross-border workers. Government is seeking to try and manage that and have sight over it. And of course, I mean, again, enforcement is our biggest challenge around legislation in principle. And so we are, you know, opposing that sort of intervention because it just creates additional burden. But there is a need to start addressing these sort of, and I'm nervous to use atypical, but let's rather use future work models, which are becoming more and more normal. What I've got here is the original list, which was concluded at NEDLAC and submitted as part of this process. And what you see there are adjustments which have been unilaterally made, as I understand it, by government. And so you can see that several of the occupations which went through this robust engagement have simply been scratched off. And significant numbers of them fall within the healthcare sector, which is extremely worrying, and particularly considering the news yesterday. Others have been added, things like instrumentation mechanicians and electrical equipment mechanics, and then more clarity sought around customer service managers with a specific focus on BPO sector. And then when we talk traffic controllers, we don't mean good old metro police. Here it's specifically around air traffic controllers. Those of us who fly, and of course I haven't been flying as much as I did prior to COVID, but it's much more hair-raising exercise now, specifically as we've seen increasing numbers of sort of safety-related issues. And this does stem back to a large extent to the fact that we just simply don't have key skills, particularly within safety and issues like air traffic control. And the challenges of getting people to stay within the country, because many of these skills are in demand around the world. And so South Africans with these skills are increasingly seeking opportunities elsewhere. And we are not in a position to import individuals with those skills as readily and as easily as we need to. So let's just touch on the kind of 3 key visa types so that we're all on the same page. So the first thing to realize, and there is a wealth of information available, and which I can happily share with you. If you're interested, please just reach out. It's also available of course, on the Department of Home Affairs and the Department of Labor's websites. But the processes involved in accessing a work permit are extensive. The documentary requirements are extensive. Even just for a general work permit, an individual is going to have to go back to their country of origin if they are currently here. And I'm thinking specifically around those who may be on exemption permits. They have to be able to supply original copies of qualifications, police clearance certificates, credit worthiness, and all kinds of other things in order to just meet the documentary requirements. There are, of course, costs associated. There are the direct costs associated with visa application, and that's even if you chose to do it yourself. So if you were working directly via the Department of Home Affairs, there are costs. It's about 3,000 Rand, I think, for a general work permit, if memory serves. But many individuals and organizations choose to partner with an immigration specialist, given the complexity and the long timelines that are usually associated with this sort of application. There would also be indirect costs, and not necessarily borne by the employer, but certainly by the employee, in regards to the traveling backwards and forwards to countries of origin, accessing documentation, hard copies and original copies, you know, vault copies and all those sorts of things. I'm not sure, for example, in Zim, and perhaps I'm being unfair, but my assumption would be that access to original, you know, birth certificates from vaults and things like that could well be exceptionally challenging to acquire. There is, of course, also the requirement to prove a lack of a local alternative. And I'll touch on that in a little bit more detail. Of course, that's one area that CAPES is also working with the Department of Labour as part of our bilateral, is setting up a mechanism by which these processes could hopefully be handled more logically. But essentially, there are requirements to prove that you have conducted an extensive labour market search yourself through advertising, etc. You cannot find local people with the skills and the requirements to fulfill the job. It has to also go through the Department of Labour's Employment Services database. They in turn will reach out to the private employment agency sector to see whether they in fact have any candidates. Now, of course, that's a double-edged sword. It makes it more complicated to access a visa, but potentially creates an opportunity for business for our industry as well, because opportunities which may not otherwise have come your way potentially will do. Where visas are granted, they will be for defined periods and very unlikely to be extended. There is an increased focus on the obligation for skills transfer during this time. So I mentioned earlier, there are three primary types of visas. One is related to the individual and independent of any employer, which means that that candidate, and I think this is also an important thing to realize as employers or agencies, is just because someone has a work permit doesn't mean that they can readily move from job to job or opportunity to opportunity. Only those who are critical skills visa holders have the ability to transition at their own choice within the period of the visa, because the visa is linked to them as a result of their scarcity and critical skills classification. General work permits and inter-company work permits are linked to the company. So intra-company typically happens with multinationals, where they may have particularly managers or specialists moving between operations as part of their own skills and capacitation or operational requirements. General work permits, far more difficult to get, and this would be where an employer has a need. They have been unable to fulfill that need in the local labour market and are therefore extending their reach beyond. Right, so in the National Labour Migration Policy document, the Department of Labour has clearly identified certain sectors which they see as priority sectors, where there is a belief that there is a disproportionate use of foreign national or foreign workers, and where they have documented abuses and perceptions of exploitation, and where they define these as being deficit of decent work. On the top of their list, and which I thought would be of particular interest to you as a group, construction and related services, followed closely by domestic work and cleaning, farming, hospitality, mining and subcontracting, security and entertainment. Now, of course, these by their nature are also usually highly flexible environments and ones where I would expect to see utilization of TESs as well. And so there is definitely already a move towards this. It'd be interesting to hear whether you've seen or heard by your clients of increased inspections. I certainly have heard that through my customers in the hospitality and related sectors, far more frequent visits from inspectors, having a look at who's being employed and what is happening. So there is going to be an increase. Now, what I thought to do is also just look at what are we seeing in terms of the numbers. So I've gone to the transformation reports, which are, of course, the consolidation of all employment equity reporting conducted. It is important to, of course, put the caveat on this that the only designated employers, so those who obviously have more than 50 employees, are compelled to report. So it's not necessarily a completely accurate reflection of the sector. But it is interesting to see kind of what the movements have been like. And so I looked at the 2019-2020 report, which of course was reflective of data prior to COVID, and then the 2021 reports, which would have seen the impact of COVID. And what's surprising to me is construction, which is deemed to be by the department as a hotspot. If you look at the numbers of foreign workers reported, and this is collectively throughout the levels of the business, is at 2.7 in the perm space, perm contingent, and 1.3 in the temp contingent. And it's significantly lower than the average of the overall private sector, which you see in the blue at the bottom. It has increased slightly in the 2021 year, but not huge, and still well below the private sector average. If we look at mining as an example, mining, of course, has a huge contingent in the perm side. Again, I think a legacy of migrant labor. And if we look at hospitality and agriculture, you see there too, and particularly on the temp side, very high proportion of foreign nationals. Very highly focused on, because it is a low-skilled job and seen as, of course, a barrier to South African employment. I popped in transportation and storage as well, just as a reference point, given that, you know, the debate that happens around foreign drivers. And you see that overall, and I, of course, recognize that drivers would not be the biggest contingent of employees within transport and storage, but there is a very small percentage of employees who are classified and reported as foreign nationals. I don't know if there are any questions at this stage. Are we comfy? Great.
Well, Natalie, maybe just to contextualize the slide in terms of numbers. So, as Natalie said, designated employers, more than 50 people, you know, an average of say 3 or 4% of 27,000 employees who are, 27,000 employers, I beg your pardon, who report every year on the Employment Equity Act. You know, this is where just at more than 50 employees, employers who report on the EA2, you have got north of 400,000 foreign nationals who could be impacted by this. And given what Natalie said, the chances are they will not easily issue these visas and permits. So of that 400,000-500,000, now that excludes your small, medium-sized businesses. So you can almost double that. So Nats, I don't know, my view, probably more than 600,000-700,000 foreign nationals could be impacted, going back to their countries, having to reinitiate the process, and then potentially not even being successful. So colleagues, the impact on workforce planning, the impact on people you place with your clients, and of course the opportunities, as Natalie points out. I mean, imagine if you've got a huge warehousing or retail client, or if you look at these stats, agriculture clients, transport clients, you know, if those clients employ 10,000 employees and 3% are foreign nationals, you are then looking at hundreds and hundreds of foreign nationals that are now going to have to be replaced. There's opportunities for TES, opportunities for MSP, RPO, NATS, Youth Employment Service, learnerships. You see, colleagues, this is the opportunity that presents itself. So if you can get hold of your client's EEA2, and you can take a look at the number of foreign nationals and proactively engage with them, this is headcount, this is strategic relationship building. Thanks, Nats.
Yeah, thanks, John. And I think that's something that I guess has constantly frustrated the Department of Labor and the Employment Equity Commission, is that, you know, one assumes that the foreign workers who would be employed would be those who are skilled and professionals, and yet we see pretty consistent numbers throughout the occupational levels. So whether you're looking at top management, which is sitting at about 3.2% foreign nationals overall, right down to unskilled labor, you're seeing a similar kind of level, 3.4, 3.5. And so I think it is fair to assume that any foreign workers who are sitting in the unskilled, semi-skilled are going to very unlikely get any form of visa, because even if that individual is excellent at what they do in their job, you still have to marry them back to a unique skill or critical skill on the critical skills list, or you have to be able to prove that you couldn't find a local person to fulfill that role. And, you know, if you're talking about a team leader in a warehouse, as brilliant as that person may be, you're not going to be able to legitimately say that there is no local alternative for a role like that. And so, as John points out, it's going to create a huge hole potentially for employers, but also opportunity for us. Maybe if I can, just before, I don't know if there are any other questions, I'll have to leave in the next sort of 7 or 8 minutes, but perhaps before John goes into this, I think for me, what is also critical is beyond obviously all the technical process, and John will take you through the slide. I think there's going to be a very important need in the next 6 months to think about the people-centric aspect of this. You've got an individual who, as John says quite rightly, has labor protection rights and cannot just be exited or treated unfairly in the process. Almost certainly going to be very unhappy about the fact that they have to leave, because goodness knows where they have to go to. Just a note, just because someone is married to a South African doesn't mean they have automatic right to work. So our visa system does not work like that. You do not get automatic right to work because you're married to a South African. So, you know, unless they are going through a naturalization process, which of course also has longer timelines and other requirements, they would still have to meet one of the available work visa opportunities. So there's going to be a need as employers to help manage this transition, and not only with the impacted workers, but their colleagues as well. So communication, engagement, connections, and really the people stuff is going to be just as important as the legal stuff around how do we reorganize our business, how do we transition skills, and how do we make sure we do it correctly. Thanks, John. I'll hand over to you, and I'll be available, as I say, for as long as I can. But if anybody does have any questions, my details are on the slides. You're welcome to reach out. Thanks, John.
Nat,
Natalie,
before you go, apologies, John. There's a message, a question from Paul. The numbers in the hospitality industry appear to be the third highest. However, according to the new document, should any foreign nationals still be employed in this industry in the future?
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question, Krista.
Yeah, Nat, so I think Paul's question's really saying, listen, if the critical skills list is what it is, most people, excuse me, most people employed in hospitality, agri, etc., are not on that critical skills list by a long shot. So Paul, and that's exactly the issue we're talking about. You know, of the 700,000 people that will be displaced out of our labor market as a result of these changes, I would be very surprised if there are 50,000 that fall within the core critical skills categories. So agri employers are in big trouble. Hospitality, we've seen the EFF marching into restaurants, etc. So Paul, that's exactly the let's call it the threat and the opportunity that we're speaking to, because you know those sectors and industries will no longer be afforded foreign national labor.
Yeah, and I think to that point, John, it's the talent pipelining behind it too, which is going to take a bit of time, but which creates opportunity, you know, in finding suitable potential individuals and training them up to the expected standards, because I think that's arguably is part of the argument that comes from employers as to why they employ foreign nationals. They generally have hugely overqualified individuals doing relatively simple work and doing it at an exponentially more service orientated level, or whatever the example might be. And so it's that gap too in saying it's all very well to say, well, here's a gap, we're going to hire a South African, but do we have a pipeline of suitably skilled, suitably motivated, suitably disciplined and engaged individuals to be able to fulfill those roles to the same kind of level?
Well, that's
Thanks.
why the PESTEL analysis is so important, isn't it? Because most of you would have submitted your WSP ATR's pivotal reports. And of course, this is a whole skills development initiative on its own that should have been picked up during the legislative reviews, Nat. But colleagues, just a few things that I want to maybe just take into a more, let's call it workplace strategy-based environment. So how do we suggest you go about giving effect to this? How do you use this to your opportunity? Bearing in mind, even though Natalie pointed out that it's 2 to 3 to 4%, some industries 5%, within those industries, you've got foreign national or multinational businesses, rather, with very high levels of foreign nationals, and they're under huge pressure. The starting point, colleagues, is a due diligence. In other words, you need to, either within your business or within your client's environment, you need to go and scope the size of the problem. In other words, you need to sit down with your clients and say, right, how many foreign nationals, not only client do you employ, but how many of our assignees are foreign nationals? Because that will give you insight into the skills types, the numbers of people, the scope of the potential challenge. Once you've understood the scope, the next thing is then to determine even their current status. Are they documented? And would they potentially fall within that critical skills list that Natalie kindly put up for us? You see, colleagues, I'm aware of many, many people that are foreign nationals that don't have legitimate permits. They bought these permits, they've obtained it through corrupt means. So your due diligence not only looks at the nature and extent and the number and types of skills involved, but you've then got to determine whether there are truly documents underpinning those current workers. The next one is governance. Now, we've been referring to the fact that even if they're undocumented and here illegally, they are fully protected under the Employment Equity Act. They're fully protected under the Labor Relations and other acts. The reason for that is, as Johnny, our boss, always reminds us, the Kylie case in Cape Town, where a prostitute was dismissed for poor performance, notwithstanding the fact that it was an illegal occupation, she still enjoyed the protection of labor law. And as Johnny always says, he doesn't want to go into how they determined Kylie was a poor performer. We leave that for a different discussion. But for today's discussion, the point is, let's say an organization has got 100 foreign nationals or 1,000 foreign nationals that may not be successful by December in achieving the new bureaucratic environment and the legitimacy of work permits. The question then, colleagues, is how do you exit those individuals? Now, some of them would be on legitimate fixed-term contracts, I would suspect, but many, many others, especially permanent staff, would have to be approached on probably a Section 189 operational requirements type of basis. And bearing in mind, colleagues, Section 189A, you all know, thanks, Natalie, Section 189A, as you all know, has got inherently a 60-day consultation period and then a 30-day notice period. So this is not something that you can put on the back burner. This is something you've got to start discussing at EXCO and board level right now, and you need to start doing the due diligence. The next thing is to look at your operational response, your organizational design, for example. So how do you replace those 100 foreign nationals? Will it be through learnerships? Yes, for youth, internships. Will it be through TESs? Will it be through permanent employment and, you know, maybe outsourcing, subcontracting, and what have you? So, colleagues, a huge opportunity in doing a due diligence, not only for your own business, but going to your company clients and suggesting the same to them. Then looking at the impact. In other words, what are the risks that emanate from this due diligence? You know, what are the risks of not terminating employment properly? What are the risks of unfair discrimination, ladies and gentlemen? Unfair discrimination on origin and culture and that kind of thing. So we've got to be incredibly careful that you deal with these both legal and operational risks. And of course, there are opportunities to use these vacancies, to use this churn in the labor force to drive your BE strategies, your tax incentives, and of course, to look at skills transfer between now and the end of the year. Our recommendations then, colleagues, is compliance. You need to ensure that you've got a very, very solid underpinning governance. And then secondly, use this opportunity to drive competitive advantage. And then finally, colleagues, in terms of the implementation of this, change management is going to be critically important. You know, colleagues, my recent engagements with leadership of businesses is that we've got a lot of managers, but very few leaders. We've got people who are very quick to take charge of the people that are under their care, but they don't take care of the people in their charge. And as leaders of organizations, the way we deal with this matter is going to send a very clear message to the rest of our staff. It's either going to build trust or break trust down. So let's not approach this just as a task. Let's approach this as any other strategic intervention in an organization. So that's really the suggestion in terms of how to operationalize this particular program and process. You know, if you've got a head count of 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 or 40,000 daily average temps, you know, you could easily take 3 to 5% of those temps and you can understand the nature and extent of the impact. Well, if we take a look at what sort of services one would want to offer to clients in this regard, and as Global, we're always here to support you, as Natalie's indicated. We can partner with you in conducting this due diligence. We can cover the permit aspects, the labor law aspects, the risk and governance aspects. So we can do the due diligence, partner you and recommendations. We can also help with skills transfer programs and agreements, fair termination protocols in terms of terminating employment correctly, optimizing employment equity and skills development opportunities. And then, of course, my personal view, ladies and gentlemen, this is not the time to look at permanent employment opportunities. Companies need to be agile. Companies need to ensure that they can easily respond to the volatile environment. So this is opportunity for subcontracting, outsourcing, functional outsourcing, TESs, recruitment process, you know, outsourcing and the like. Great opportunities for you to re-establish your standing with your clients. And then project management and immigration consulting. We do partner with a company who are experts at all things related to immigration in terms of these 3 visa options that Natalie has indicated: critical skills, general work permit, and intra-company permit. So really exciting opportunities. And then, Krista and Albie, with your permission, I want to end off before we open for final questions with a few more considerations. You know, I'm very passionate about your industry. So let's talk about things other than the foreign national labor migration plan. Other things, colleagues, that are on front of mind for me personally is the issue of platform workers. Natalie referred to the Employment Services Act, which talks about the regulation of employment platforms and gig workers off employment platforms. And all I want to say on that is we need to run a webinar very soon on understanding that if clients make use of a platform, such as Checkers 60, such as Uber, such as whatever platform it is, where work arrangements are being managed, you're going to have to start being very clear on who the employer is, who carries the employment responsibilities and liabilities across the laws. That's the first thing I just want to point out. So if you've got a platform for engagement on gig work, Upwork, Elance, those types of platforms, we need to start having that discussion. The next one I want to talk about is the code of good practice on harassment, on preventing and eliminating harassment. Now, I know in your environment, you are very, very hectic, and it's easy to maybe just say, well, harassment is a very, let's call it a substantive soft issue. Let's just leave it. Colleagues, harassment is rife at the workplace under the new definitions of harassment. Things like inappropriate body language, being overly critical of people, not considering their personal circumstances, marginalizing people, using foul language. Colleagues, those are all definitions in the harassment code, which could comprise harassment. Now, remember, if you found guilty of any form of harassment, which is an unfair discrimination form, for 3 years, you will not get a certificate of compliance from the Department of Employment and Labor under the Employment Equity Act regime. By implication, for 3 years, you can't tender for public sector work, and maybe even private sector clients will push you out. I'm raising harassment because you need to ensure that you have got very clear protocols, policies, procedures, grievance procedures that you share with your assignees when they are inducted in their handbooks, so that if ever something happens, whether they are harassed or they harass any other parties, you can prove that you will not be vicariously liable for their act. The only way you can prove that is by showing you've created an awareness and you've got very clear policies, procedures, and standards. Colleagues, something small like that, I don't mean small because all forms of harassment are unacceptable, but I'm saying something that slips through the cracks, ends up at the CCMO or Labour Court, you found guilty for 3 years, no public sector work guaranteed. And then maybe just the final comment I'll be from my side is employment equity reporting. What we are seeing is a lot of clients becoming a lot more interested in TESs because after 3 months, from an employment equity point of view, their temps are reported above the line, not in the temporary line. And if your temps are designated people and they're reported above the line, it helps our clients with their employment equity progress and with their stats. So I know I'm rambling on, but I just thought I would use the opportunity to touch on some other areas that I'm dealing with at present. But LB, back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, John. Now the floor is open. We've got John for a couple of more minutes here. So, guys, I think there's a lot of issues that he's mentioned now, and maybe some of the other issues that let's open the floor and ask John some questions at least, and then we can derive some value out of the meeting. One thing that you mentioned, John, I understand the concept of the platform worker where we've got an app and now we send X, Y, and Z and it works through that app. But if we go and look at, we consider the fourth industrial revolution and the gig workers that you find, I mean, you could potentially, in South Africa, if I want to develop an app, I go on locally and I put out something there into the great wide internet, and I've got 4 guys from, Czechoslovakia contacting me and say, well, I'm going to ask you $300 and how are we going to manage that? Because obviously they are foreigners, they are producing something that I'm going to use in South Africa. How in your mind, I mean, we know we don't have all of the answers, but in your mind, how would a concept like that work? How is it going to be managed? How is it going to be policed?
LB, that's a very, very interesting matter. So even this morning, I was looking at some ILO documentation, on that. And the World Employment Confederation, and maybe, Krista, we can share this with the colleagues as well as the slides, but if you take a look at the World Employment Confederation, your global body, you know, digital strategy meets workforce strategy, LB, and that's exactly what you're saying. And what they then do in this research, because of course the World Employment Confederation are going to be influencing the ILO and labor standards going forward. But there they talk about the fact that, firstly on the left, the platform work growth is 190% year on year. So it's off a small base, but it's massive growth compared to non-platform workforce solutions. Colleagues, and then if we do look at this in a bit more detail, it's any work organized through a digital labor platform and performed, in this case in the EU, by an individual. So it's digital, it's work performed through the digital platform. Now, we've got the presumption as to who's an employee or not. And even in South Africa, in section 200, I think, Mari, guys, you're going to have to help me, 200A or B, there's that rebuttable presumption. But then they go into the algorithmics, the algorithms that underpin this, and then the obligations around that. But what made me think of this, LB, when you raised that issue, this is what they're starting to propose to the ILO. So the key question is, who controls the performance of the work? You know, so who determines and sets the limits of remuneration? So who determines the REM? And then, of course, who is it that controls the work? You know, the appearance, the conduct, the performance of work. So it's the old thing about control. It's the old thing about who pays. And those are the things that are going to become important, because, you know, you might think you're just using a labor platform, and next minute you're the employer of record, you know, when something goes wrong. Meanwhile, you thought that you're merely just intermediating. So, you know, those are things that are going to have to be addressed. And here you can see the open talent ecosystem. It's just unbelievable to take a look and see the growth in this context. But that's why I said I think we need to start having this discussion as an industry, so that we can take the Employment Services Act platform section and maybe give some flesh to it, so that we can start regulating ourselves rather than, you know, have it externally imposed on us.
Thanks. It's truly interesting. You know, yeah, it's not as simple as sending Sergey a requirement and he does it for you and you pay him, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And then, of course, right now at NEDLAC, they're busy negotiating with the unions around labor law reviews, and Johnny tells me the one thing is they want to extend labor laws to gig workers. So you know, they want to take all gray areas out. So your checkers 60 guys, your lots, etc., they'll immediately become employees. Your Uber drivers, they'll immediately become employees. I see Colleen's got her hand up. Albie, let's hear from her.
Hi, thanks, John. Very interesting conversations here. In terms of the, so this expands in terms of EU, and we're talking about people that are digital nomads. Is that what we're referring to? With the new age of people being able to work away from home, they can basically live anywhere and work anywhere, and just provide a service on a sort of independent basis, but be based wherever they are in the world.
Yes, that's exactly as you've articulated, Colleen. That's exactly it. Now, you can imagine all the variables that need to be taken into account. You know, which countries' laws apply. So you've got someone in India doing your website or doing design for your marketing. You know, so, you know, this is why the ILO has to so quickly adjust and align, and not just the ILO, but as I said, the Employment Services Act, Colleen, already touching on platform work. So you can take a look at that in the Act. I think my concern is for organizations like yourselves, where, for example, a TES now goes and complements its traditional services with a platform service, where clients can contract for work or workers through your platform. The question is the TES still exempt from certain legal obligations? Does the client still pick up all the same liabilities in using a TES in terms of deeming, etc., etc.? And Colleen, I don't think that level of granular detail has been considered. Who reports on these people in employment equity reports? If you're using someone in India to do, or in China to do some of your work on a regular basis, and they do it for more than 3 months in a year, do you include them under foreign nationals in your employment equity report? These are the types of questions that I don't think many people have considered. Thanks.
Yeah, I agree 100%, let alone the tax implications.
But you know what, if you get it right, Colleen, if you get it right, oh my goodness, because clients want certainty, So if you can put a matrix together and say, use our platform, this is how we govern it, well, then you're going to be streaks ahead.
Right, guys, any other questions from people on the meeting for John?
Not that I can see, LB.
So you've got an easy crowd, John. Right. Guys, if there's nothing else, I would like to thank you for John and for Natalie for the interesting insights. And for all of the members that are here, these are initiatives that we as an ExCo from the TESD is taking forward to have more of these relevant sort of discussions for our members rather than the normal monthly meetings that we've got, trying to get things that are real and experts like John and Natalie in to keep us informed, to understand where our business strategies need to go to and how we are going to refine them to make sure that we stay sustainable and relevant going forward with all of these changes that happen.
LB, if I can maybe just add, please. Thank you everyone for your attendance and participation. It's highly, highly appreciated. I see on the platform, I noticed some new names. I don't know if it's maybe from non-member companies. If you're not a member of the TESD, please pop me a mail, or you can visit our website at tesd.org.za. So that I can provide you with more information, and we will make the recording and the slides available to everyone that's on the platform. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Krista. Yes, Keegan. Keegan, the floor is yours. There's just a hand clap.
Yeah, I was just saying thanks for the informative session.
100%, Keegan. Pleasure having you here.
Yeah, it was a good one. Thanks, LB.
Thanks, guys. John, thank you again for your time, and hopefully we'll chat soon.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Judy. Bye. Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. All the best.
Bye, everyone.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers, guys. Thanks for the session.
Cheers, Paul. Are you phoning home with that photo?
Always trying to find home.
Cheers.
Yeah.
Thanks, LB.
Thanks, Krista.
See you soon. We'll chat after the meeting. I see Nicole was on the platform, so it'll probably go onto our social media sites and the website.
Cool,
you very much.
100%.
Okay, take care.
Thanks.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.